The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a golden glow through the glass walls of Jake's family home. I had spent countless evenings there, laughing, sharing stories, and making memories with my best friend of over a decade. Tonight felt no different, or so I thought, until she walked into the room. Jake's sister, Lila, had been a distant name in our conversations for years. She was always off somewhere, traveling or studying abroad, a face I'd only seen in family photos. When Jake had casually mentioned her return a week ago, I hadn't given it much thought. But now, seeing her step into the gathering, I felt a shift, a quiet tremor I couldn't quite explain. She carried herself with effortless grace, her dark curls framing a face that seemed both familiar and entirely new. Her smile was warm yet reserved, her gaze sharp and curious. I watched as she greeted Jake with a playful jab to his shoulder, her laughter ringing out like a melody. Jake pulled her toward me, his grin wide with pride. "This is my sister, Lila," he said, his arm draped over her shoulders. "Lila, meet my best friend. The guy who keeps me sane." Her eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to blur. "Nice to finally meet you," she said, extending a hand. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying an unspoken confidence. I took her hand, feeling an unexpected jolt as our fingers touched. "Nice to meet you too," I managed, my voice betraying a hint of nervousness I couldn't shake. As the evening unfolded, I found myself drawn to her in ways I hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just beautiful. She was magnetic. She spoke with passion about her travels, her words painting vivid pictures of foreign cities and vibrant cultures. Her laughter was infectious, her presence commanding without effort. But it wasn't just admiration. Beneath the surface, a quiet unease began to stir. Every glance I stole, every word I exchanged with her, felt like crossing an invisible line. Jake's voice echoed in my mind, a reminder of the bond we shared, a loyalty I had never questioned until now. The night ended too quickly. As the guests began to leave, I found myself lingering, watching her from across the room. She caught my gaze and smiled, a subtle, knowing curve of her lips. My chest tightened. Driving home, I replayed the evening in my mind, wrestling with a storm of emotions. Lila was Jake's sister, someone I had no right to feel this way about. Yet the intensity of my reaction to her was undeniable, leaving me on the edge of something I wasn't ready to name. For the first time in years, I questioned my resolve, and as I parked my car, I realized one thing. This wasn't going to be easy. The following days passed in a blur, but Lila's image lingered in my mind like an uninvited guest. I told myself it was a fleeting fascination, something I could ignore. That resolve faltered when Jake invited me to another gathering a week later, this time at a local cafe. I arrived to find Jake engrossed in conversation with a group of friends. Lila sat at the far end of the table, her head tilted slightly as she listened, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. When she saw me, her face lit up with a smile, and I felt an inexplicable warmth spread through me. "Hey, stranger," she greeted, her tone light but inviting. I slid into the seat beside her, acutely aware of the space between us. "Hey yourself. Enjoying being back home?" "It's different," she admitted, her eyes scanning the room as though searching for the right words. "After years of living out of a suitcase, this place feels smaller, quieter. But it's nice, familiar." Her candor caught me off guard. I found myself drawn into her world, asking about her travels and the stories behind them. She spoke with a mix of nostalgia and longing, her words painting vivid images of bustling markets, serene coastlines, and late nights in foreign cities. As she spoke, I began to see layers to her, a complexity that made it impossible to look away. She wasn't just Jake's sister anymore. She was Lila, a woman with dreams, struggles, and a spark that was undeniably magnetic. Over the next hour, the group began to dwindle, leaving just the three of us. Jake, ever the social butterfly, stepped away to greet a friend, leaving Lila and me alone. "So," she said, her eyes locking onto mine, "how long have you and Jake been friends?" Since we were kids, I replied, leaning back in my chair. He's practically family at this point. She smiled, a hint of mischief in her expression. And yet, I'm only meeting you now. Jake doesn't share his toys easily. Does he? I chuckled, her playful jab catching me off guard. I guess not. The conversation flowed effortlessly after that, each word weaving an unspoken connection. I could feel the walls I had built beginning to crack, and it terrified me. When Jake returned, the spell broke, but the lingering awareness of her presence didn't fade. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of my feelings settled over me. She was Jake's sister, someone I had no business being this drawn to. Yet, with every shared word and every glance, I felt myself slipping further. I told myself it was nothing, a passing infatuation. But deep down, I knew better. The line between admiration and something deeper was growing thinner, and I was inching closer to crossing it. It started innocently enough. Brief conversations when Jake wasn't around, chance encounters that felt too frequent to be mere coincidence. Each meeting chipped away at the careful distance I tried to maintain. Lila had a way of drawing people in, her presence both disarming and magnetic. Yet, the growing closeness between us felt like a shadow hanging over my friendship with Jake, an unspoken betrayal that I couldn't ignore. One evening, Jake asked me to drop off some books at his house while he was out. I hesitated, knowing Lila would likely be home, but refusing felt suspicious. When I arrived, she greeted me at the door, barefoot and wrapped in a loose sweater, her hair falling in waves over her shoulders. "Jake's not here," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "But you can leave the books in his room." I placed the books down and turned to leave, but her voice stopped me. "Stay a while," she said, her tone soft but insistent. "It's been a long day, and I could use some company." I hesitated, knowing I should go, but the look in her eyes held me in place. We sat in the living room, talking about everything and nothing. The conversation flowed easily, but beneath the surface, a quiet tension brewed. She laughed at something I said, the sound warm and unguarded, and for a moment, I let myself forget the lines I was supposed to honor. Then she shifted closer, her knee brushing mine. "You're different from Jake's other friends," she said, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "How so?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "You listen," she said simply. Her gaze lingered, searching mine, and the air between us grew heavier. My pulse quickened, every fiber of my being screaming at me to step back, to leave before the fragile boundary between us shattered. But I didn't move. Her hand rested lightly on mine, a touch so subtle yet electric that it felt as though the world had tilted. "I shouldn't be here," I said, my voice strained. "Why not?" she asked, her tone a mixture of challenge and vulnerability. "Because you're Jake's sister," I replied, the words coming out harsher than I intended. The flicker of hurt in her eyes was enough to break the moment. She pulled her hand back, her expression guarded. "I see," she said, standing up. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." I stood as well, guilt twisting in my chest. "It's not that," I said, but the words felt hollow. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts a chaotic mix of longing and shame. I had come dangerously close to crossing a line I swore I'd never approach. The weight of what nearly happened settled heavily over me, and for the first time, I realized just how fragile my resolve truly was. The tension between Lila and me was undeniable now, a fragile thread stretched taut and ready to snap. Avoiding her became my unspoken rule, but the weight of our last conversation lingered, an unfinished symphony that demanded closure. Jake, oblivious to the storm raging within me, continued to trust me implicitly, his loyalty unwavering. That trust was a constant reminder of the line I would not cross. A week later, Jake invited me over for dinner. He spoke animatedly about a new project at work, But my attention wandered as Lila entered the room, carrying a plate of food. She avoided my gaze, her usual warmth replaced by an air of detachment. The change stung more than I cared to admit, but it also solidified my resolve. After dinner, Jake excused himself to take a phone call, leaving Lila and me alone in the quiet of the living room. The silence between us was heavy, fraught with the things we couldn't say. Finally, I broke it. "Lila," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "About the other night." She looked up, her expression guarded. "You don't need to explain," she said quickly. "I get it. You're loyal to Jake." "It's not just that," I said, leaning forward. "You mean a lot to him. And to me, too. But if I act on how I feel—" Her breath hitched at my admission, but she said nothing, allowing me to continue. "If I act on this, it's not just Jake I'd hurt. It's you too. What we feel now might seem real, but it's built on something fragile, something that could shatter under the weight of what's at stake." She looked down, her fingers twisting nervously. "So, you're saying this, whatever this is, it's nothing?" "No," I said, my voice softening. "It's not nothing. But it can't be something either. Not without destroying the people we care about most." The silence stretched, but it felt different this time, not tense, but accepting. She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I respect that," she said quietly. "Even if it hurts." Jake returned moments later, his cheerful demeanor breaking the solemn atmosphere. Lila and I exchanged a final glance, an unspoken understanding passing between us. The weight I'd been carrying eased slightly, though the ache in my chest remained. Driving home, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a quiet sense of pride. I had made the right choice even if it wasn't the easy one. Loyalty had triumphed over temptation, and though the road ahead wouldn't be simple, I knew I'd face it with my integrity intact. In the weeks that followed, the distance between Lila and me grew, not out of avoidance but respect. Our fleeting connection became a memory, one that reminded me of the importance of boundaries and the strength it took to honor them. Though the pain lingered, I found solace in the unshakable bond one still had with Jake, a friendship that had weathered the storm and come out unbroken.